Welcome, and congratulations for reaching your 100th day on the trail. Today, at our century mark, we have 3 readings. Romans chapter 4, verses 1 through 25, Numbers chapter 7, and Judith chapter 7, verses 1 through 18. As we continue the story of Judith, Nebuchadnezzar's general, Holofernes, has advanced into Judea and is approaching Bethulia. One of the first actions of Holofernes was to cut off the water supply, which is a precursor to laying siege to the city. This was a well-known military tactic for invading armies. Once the water supply was seized, the citizens of the town would be forced to surrender or to die of dehydration. Therefore, some walled cities in this period would dig tunnels from within the city walls to access springs from underground. For example, in this photo, from the ruins of the city of Hatzor, we can see the remains of a tunnel that was dug to a local spring to protect their water supply. The system at Hatzor involved digging a massive vertical shaft, approximately 100 feet deep. This was followed by a stepped tunnel extending another 75 feet horizontally into the bedrock to reach a natural aquifer. This allowed residents to access water from within the city walls via a set of stairs to protect the city's water supply during times of siege or conflict. Similar tunnels were found in Megiddo, a strategic location which protected the Jezreel Valley. Also, in Jerusalem we have Hezekiah's Tunnel, which is an ancient water conduit about 1,750 feet long and carved through solid bedrock to channel water from the Gihon Springs back into the city. This tunnel is traditionally attributed to the reign of King Hezekiah of Judah, who ruled from approximately 715 to 686 BC. In Romans chapter 4, Paul moves from explaining his thesis in detail in chapter 3 to providing an example which illustrates his thesis. To do this, Paul uses an example from the Torah to illustrate his argument. Paul turns to Abraham as an example of faith. In the story of Abraham, Paul shows how God's covenant with Abraham is established by God's promise prior to anything that Abraham did, including circumcision. So we find this in Romans 4, beginning in verse 9. We say, "Faith is reckoned to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it reckoned to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? It was not after, but before he was circumcised. He received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the ancestor of all who believe without being circumcised, and who thus have righteousness reckoned to them, and likewise the ancestor of the circumcised, who are not only circumcised, but who also follow the example of the faith that our ancestor Abraham had before he was circumcised." As Paul has established, God chose Abraham first. God offered his promises to Abraham first. This is grace. Abraham then received God's promises and trusted that God would carry out those promises. And it was this faith of Abraham, his trust in God, which was reckoned to him as righteousness. Therefore, prior to circumcision, which was a significant identifying factor for the Jewish people, Abraham demonstrated faith. And Paul points out, this is also true of the Gentiles who are faithfully trusting Jesus. In Abraham, Paul also highlights 2 characteristics of faith that help further his argument. First, Abraham gives glory to God, as seen in verse 20. This reflects the polar opposite of those who refuse to honor God or give thanks to him in chapters 1 and 2. By glorifying God, Abraham acknowledges and honors God's presence and power in the world and in his life. Second, in verse 21, Abraham is fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. As we saw in the story of the Yakedah, the near sacrifice of his only son Isaac, Abraham trusted the power and faithfulness of God to keep his promises. It was Abraham's faith, despite his own weakness and frailty, that God reckoned to him as righteousness. In the same way, despite the uncertainty that we see in the world around us and the struggles that we face daily, we trust in the grace of God. Grace that came to us first, when we were still dead in our old ways of living. Grace that walked with us on the earth in the presence of his only Son, Jesus. And faith in the one who promised us, his followers, that he would indeed be with us, always, to the very end of the age. Thank you for joining us on our 100th day. Until next time, stay on the trail.